So, we are in the Parsha Mishpatim. Okay, Mishpatim, which have to do with the rules. These are the rules. And there's kind of a shift here because remember, we see the dramatic episode in our previous Torah portion where Moses is going up the mountain to receive the commandments of Yahweh. But after all of those events that happened, where we had the fire come down the mountain, we had the great voice that spoke to all the people as a witness, and remember how frightened they were to have that. Just imagine it was like thunder. To have that voice, such a real, tangible presence, the spectacle show itself in front of them. They were, many of them, I don't think I could, it would be an understatement to say they were just scared for their life. And some of them fled when that happened. We read about that in one of the previous portions. But this particular one goes into some categories of particular commandments. And it has to do with, and I will say that much of what's in here has been looked at in this society, being that it's a Judeo-Christian kind of an underpinning. We're moving away from that now, but in its inception of this country, many of these principles that we find in Mishpatim were put into civil law, and that's a simple fact if you study that. And so basically, we see about things that we don't experience today. For example, indentured servitude. We don't really see that today, at least in the overt sense, that it was very, very real. Maybe even as much as a couple, 300 years ago in this nation. And it was very real all throughout Europe, where you had a manor lord and then you had a class of serfs that simply worked land which belonged to the manor lord, and ultimately even the manor lord's lands belonged to the king. Okay, if you study history in Europe, you'll see. And so the Bible actually goes into detail about proper ways to treat indentured servants. Now, I don't want you to mistake something here. This is not chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is what was experienced in throughout the history in some places of the United States was not what the Bible talks about. I want you to understand that the rules are very important to consider when you talk about something like indentured servitude. And so, do you know that by this they would serve someone, usually a landowner. Either they would do agricultural things, or they would, whatever job they had. There's a lot of jobs in an agrarian society that have to be done. There's a lot of manual labor that has to be done. And so, if they didn't have enough money or a way to feed themselves or clothe themselves or take care of themselves, they had no Social Security. There was no welfare. Essentially, people had to join themselves. If they couldn't do that for themselves, they had to join themselves to someone who was well off, who was a landowner. Okay, and so the ideal was is that a Hebrew indentured servant would join himself to a maybe a well-to-do landowner, a Hebrew landowner, and he would work for so many years. But on the seventh year, he was to go free. Now, there's also things like personal injury, because this sort of cascades onto the idea of indentured servitude, that these people were to be treated justly and correctly, but also out in general society. Let's say you have, like today, we see videos all over X where people are beating up each other. Horrible, horrific stuff that's coming out on video if you pay attention to social media at all. But the Bible prescribes particular penalties for these kinds of incidences. And so not only hurting another person in an unjust way, but also messing with somebody's property. There is the idea of reparation. You ever wonder where Even courts today, some of them still have the idea of reparations in terms of if a thief is caught defrauding or stealing someone, then the court will affix a fixed amount of money and they have to pay that. Now, in some cases, they either have to come up with that money to get out of jail or they have to pay that to get off the hook, so to speak. They're not totally off the hook. They have a record, but all of that has a basis in what we find in the Torah and in this particular chapter, Mishpatim. And so, when you think of a lot of people in proximity and they've got all kinds of animals, even things that I was cognizant of when I was a boy, I grew up on horse farm. And most of the horses were wonderful creatures. Wonderful. They were so docile. Every horse had its own character, just like dogs. You have any experience with dogs? They all have their own character, their own, the kind of quirks, their personality quirks. That's the way horses were. Oh my goodness, we had one horse. His name was Teledor. That was the meanest. I literally thought the devil was in that horse, and it could have been. But my dad bought that horse. Now that horse had been abused, but he was very, very violent, and sadly, we ended up having to send him, send him somewhere else. But the thing is that you have animals that can do damage not only to people but to each other. And the Bible prescribes remedy for those situations. And there's particular categories that we can look at here. For example, we talk about the idea of responsibility, the idea of determining who's responsible. And then once you determine who's responsible for causing the damage to someone else, then you have to affix some kind of a liability upon them, some kind of monetary compensation if a person's animal or property has been damaged. Okay, and so all of that is in there. It talks about things that can work into, say, the renter and the landlord, or the borrower and the one who is lending money, and so on. There's many of those kinds of things. We also get a keen sense in this particular parsha that Yahweh is concerned about an idea called social justice. Now, I'm not using that term in the way that some of these far left Marxist people do. Now, they might take a good principle, but they warp it to go far beyond what Yahweh intended. Yahweh is very just and equitable in how he administers things, and particularly social justice. We know that Yahweh has a heart for the poor. We know that Yahweh has a heart for the oppressed. We know that Yahweh does not want mistreatment happening but to particular classes of people. For example, strangers or wayfarers are just trying to pass through, or if they are trying to follow the rules. Yahweh does not want mistreatment of that class. He does not want mistreatment of widows or orphans. Remember that many times throughout this portion, Yahweh had that particular phrase, remember how you were slaves in Egypt. When you go through something so, traumatic, like what the children of Israel went through in Egypt when the evil Pharaoh came to power, my goodness, doesn't that make your heart recognize the position you are in, and you're far more likely to have compassion on someone who's in a similar situation? Well, that is the heart of our Heavenly Father. He wants us to empathize with these classes of people and to do right by them. And maybe even go a little bit beyond. That's up to the individual. It's up to the head of the family, obviously. Also, Yahweh has a very keen dislike of financial slavery. What do I mean by that? Well, talk about usury. These credit cards today, these poor kids that get out of college, not only are they saddled with their school debt, but I remember when I was in college, especially in the usually on every university, there's a store where you get your books, you get your pencils, your pens, you get, you can get a backpack. I remember that. Um, but here's something they really pushed: credit cards, credit cards, credit cards. Now you look at the usury, the interest, they call it interest, really usury. You look at that on there, oh my goodness, 20 some percent. And even today, when someone buys a vehicle, I saw something on X the other day where this guy bought a truck and he paid the payments. But because the amount of usury was so bad, he ended up paying like 50,000 more. If he'd got done paying all that usury, it'd have been like 50,000 more for a $100,000 truck. Now, obviously, this was a heavy duty work truck. But you see, Yahweh doesn't like banks when they do that. He has a keen sense of social justice. And do you know that in the scriptures it actually says it's a sin for brother to loan to another brother in the faith at usury? Did you know that? There's commandments like that. Also, he does not like when you have corruption in the judicial process. How much corruption can we see even today in the West? How much are these people, these judges and so on, taking bribes, and then their justice is perverted? This particular passage speaks in detail about that, how Yahweh really dislikes that, does not like falsehood, does not like bribery. And, this is something that happens a lot. People tend to follow the crowd, don't they? Remember during COVID how they followed the crowd and how many, many innocent people were harmed, their businesses were lost. Some were put in jail just for walking on an empty beach. Some people were put in jail just for having service together and believers coming together. Horrific things, you see. And so, why did that happen? Because there is an inclination within this group think of humanity to follow the crowd. There's somehow in the minds of many peoples, the numbers of people who believe a certain way are correct, but Yahweh doesn't want his people to think that way at all. And that's an important thing to consider. Now, there's some other things like agricultural laws, the sabbatical year. Some of these are somewhat odd. You wonder, well, what's the purpose behind them? And yes, there's been a lot of postulation on why such and such occurred. Why did Yahweh put that you can sow your land for so many years, but on the seventh you are to let it rest? Why did Yahweh do that? I know some of it could just be related to faith. Some of it could be related to giving the land a rest. I've heard lots of reasons for that. Also, the feasts of Yahweh are talked about and how there are three shalosh regalim. Have you ever heard that term, shalosh regalim? Well, that means ascension feast. And so these particular feasts, these are the big ones: Passover, Tabernacles, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's Shavuot. Those are the ascension feasts. So they are the ones where the men would go to wherever Yahweh's name was. If they were spread out in the land and there was a tabernacle that the men would show up. If it was established in Jerusalem and there was a temple, the men would show up. Yes, if maybe they would take children, maybe they would take some women, but some people had to stay home, obviously, to tend the land and the animals, obviously. So we talk about this as well. Also about particular dietary things. That some of it kind of you wonder, well, what's the sense of such and such? So, say, for example, the cooking a kid in his mother's milk. All of that has particular reason. Apparently, Yahweh doesn't like, multiple generations wiped out. Maybe that has something to do with that. But Yahweh's ways are higher than our ways, and our duty is to learn His ways and get on board. And I think we all can agree with that. And so ultimately, these are parts of the rules of the covenant between Yahweh and his people Israel. Now, remember that after all of these things were spoken to the people, uh, the people gave the right answer, didn't they? They heard all of this. They heard all these rules. They didn't argue with Yahweh. Well, partly because they were scared out of their minds anyway. They knew that Yahweh was real and he could punish them if they messed up. And of course, that fear gradually declined over time, didn't it? But at this moment, the people famously proclaim in Hebrew, Na'aseh v'nishma, which is, we will do and we will hear. Now, if we say that to our Heavenly Father, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will hear, don't you think that warms the heart of our Heavenly Father and His Son, Yeshua Messiah? Even Yeshua Messiah said, if you love me, keep my commands, right? If you love me, because when Yahweh thinks about love, he pairs it with obedience, doesn't he? Isn't that a beautiful thing? And so there's some things on there also about altars and sacrifices, but it's a good portion to look at. And this, I just wanted to do sort of a synopsis for you, so that you would think about some of these things. And so at this time, we may have some comments. If you have any comments, we'll open up the floor now. If there's anything that you can remember in this portion, typically, if we have a special teacher, I encourage people to read the portion before they come to Shabbat, and so you're familiar with what's being in the portion. Sometimes we read the portion, but if we have a special speaker, we try to do this. Go ahead, Brother Giacomo.
I think a lot of us agree. It probably goes without saying, this being a closed loop after all, Torah keepers, that this was a ketubah. This was a proposal from Yahweh, our husband, to us, the bride. And when the people said, "We will do and obey," that was "I do." And then Moshe proceeded to go up into the mountain to initiate the wedding ceremony. The one drawback is the mediator of that wedding ceremony was gone for a little bit too long, and the people panicked and started building the golden calf. It's
Mhm.
where we have our troubles, unfortunately. We think that it's okay to panic when our mediator is gone. The same with Yeshua. You see a lot of people that are just kind of living their own way and thinking that grace will save us. And, my old brother Ed Harris, he always to say, grace is greasy. If you're not careful, you will slide right into the pit of hell.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good comments there, brother. Any other thoughts? Any other thoughts from anyone in the room on this or questions? I mean, we have some knowledgeable people in here. Maybe you have some questions about some of this. Myself, I think of myself as a lifelong learner. So, I might not have the answer on something, but I know people who will have a better answer on something. Okay. I try to keep that attitude in mind. Any other thoughts on this particular portion? We have a comment here. This was in regard to following the crowd, I believe. We see here, Brother Matthew says, this is why democracy is always bound to fail eventually. Yes. And Brother Chris puts this now. I think this was, I'm trying to remember the guy, the famous guy that said this. I think it might have been Benjamin Franklin. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he quotes here, democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what's for dinner. Glad we have a republic. That's a good one there, brother. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Any other thoughts? These things are important for us to know because look at how out of kilter our society is. If everyone knew the law of Yahweh, and there were punishments for non-compliance, for example, usury, for all of these other things. Imagine how different our society would be, and for the better, far more for the better. And this is Psalms 1 by Left and Right Ministries.
Nor does he stand in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the Torah of Yahweh. But his delight the Torah of Yahweh, and on his ways he meditates day and night. He meditates day and night. He'll be like a tree firmly planted by streams of living water, which yield to seed in its season, and its leaf does not wither, and in all he does he prospers. This is the life. It's in the Torah of Yahweh, but his delight is in the Torah of Yahweh, and on his ways he meditates day and night. He meditates day and night. But the wicked are not so. They are like the chaff which the wind blows away. And therefore the wicked shall not rise in the judgment, nor the sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For Yahuwah knows the way of the righteous. For Yahuwah knows the way of the righteous. For Yahuwah knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Mighty light is in the Torah of Yahweh. Mighty light is in the Torah of Yahweh. His word Yeshua, and our delight is in the Torah of Yahweh. And our delight is in the Torah of Yahweh, and on his way we meditate day and night. We meditate day and night. We meditate day and night.
Okay, and that is Left and Right Ministries. And the song is called Psalms 1, taken right from the scripture. You'll find that the majority of their music is taken directly right out of the scripture. something we don't see very often, especially if you venture into the churches, as I am off to do, just to see what the condition is and to see what the Father is doing there or whether there is dysfunction. Well, it's clear that a lot of what is being done in modern music is completely antithetical to sound doctrine taken from the scripture. And so we hope you guys enjoyed that. We're going to introduce Brother Chris Wall. Remember that Brother Chris has a very good YouTube channel. There's a lot of very deep and useful teachings on there. It's called The Ancient Paths. And you can go here all you have to do is go to YouTube, put in the search field the @ sign, Ancient Paths YT. Now, Brother Chris has a lot of experiences. He's gone through many different churches, as I did when I was a little younger. And he spent a lot of time putting these kinds of presentations together, really with the goal to benefit and encourage the heart of the believer. And what he puts out does that. I mean, it hits the mark. And so today, I believe he's going to be presenting Witness of the Sands. It's part two, Archeology of Egypt, and how that supports the biblical narrative. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Brother Chris.
It was a great song. I love that psalm, and the imagery there talking about, how we shall be like trees planted by the waters when we delight in his Torah. I think that's just an awesome message. Where we left off last time, and where we left off last time was by taking a look at the Amarna letters. Now, last time in the first half of this teaching, we went through and looked at 10 or 12 different archaeological findings that have been found in Egypt, which totally corroborate the story in the Bible about the Exodus. And the main reason why we do this is because all of the academic circles, doesn't matter what country you're from, anywhere in the world, if you go to college and learn anything about Egyptian history, they will tell you that there's no proof in the archaeological record of the Exodus ever happening, because it is the goal, it is the intention of the academic system to essentially replace biblical history. They want you to learn a fraudulent version of history because they are living in rebellion, and they do not like the possibility that there is in fact a God who gets to make the rules. Because if there is a God who gets to make the rules, then they need to be keeping them. And they don't want to keep them. And they don't want to acknowledge him. And so they obfuscate and hide and, deflect anything that has to do with the Bible and its historical accuracy. Now, I'm not going to go back through all the different things that we covered last time. I just want the thing that we're going to go back over again is these Amarna letters, because they are going to be very relevant to the things that I'm going to talk about today. The main goal of this second half of this teaching today is I am going to take you through some of the things that have been found archaeologically that I believe you can identify who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So the main talking point today is going to be talking about who was that Pharaoh who was laid low by the God of Israel. And one of the things that I think helps identify this character is these things called the Amarna letters. Now, I'm not going to go back through each of the individual points. I'm just going to kind of wrap this up real quick and move on. But there's all of these clay tablets that have been found, and what the vast majority of them, what they are is they are correspondence from the governors of cities in the land that we now call Israel. Um, at the time of the Exodus, the Canaanites were in control of these lands for the most part, but the Pharaoh in Egypt was the governing power over them to many extents. And it's kind of a situation like with Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has its own local government. It does its own thing, but it is technically a territory of the United States. The same thing applies with these Canaanite city-states that were in the land of Israel before Israel got there. They were inhabited by Canaanites, and they did in many cases have their own kings and things like that. But the Pharaoh was the ruling regional power over them, and so they paid tribute to the Pharaoh. And if they ever didn't pay tribute, he would come and remind them why they needed to pay tribute. Um, but these Amarna letters, what they are is they are a collection of correspondence from the leaders of the cities that were being taken by what they called the Habiru. And the Habiru are the Israelites. And in fact, that's the origin of the term Hebrew actually comes from the Akkadian word Habiru, which essentially means people without a land or wandering people. Now, these letters say some very interesting things in regards to what I believe is Joshua's conquest of Canaan. Now, I'm just going to pop through these real quick and just read a couple of my favorites that we've already covered this last week, but some of these are very interesting. Like this last one here, the tablet called EA 366 from Shuardata, mayor of Hebron. All of my brothers have abandoned me. Only Abdi Heba, mayor of Jerusalem, and I have been at war with the Habiru. And so there you have the leader of Hebron saying that only he and the leader of Jerusalem are the only two that are now able to stand against the Habiru. And then as we move forward, we see that that didn't last very long because now all of a sudden in 286, he's saying to the Pharaoh, the king has no lands. The Habiru has plundered all the lands of the king. And then in 287, he says, they are now attempting to take Jerusalem. Pharaoh has placed his name in Jerusalem forever. He cannot abandon the land of Jerusalem. Gezer, Ashkelon, Lachish have given oil, food, and supplies to the Habiru. Now, those are all cities that you see in the scripture. Ashkelon, Lachish, Gezer, and Jerusalem are all very important cities that you see in the books of the Kings in particular. And so what this tablet tells us is that the leader of the city of Jerusalem, prior to it being, controlled by the Israelites, is telling Pharaoh, "Hey, you're losing all your land, and you placed your name here in this city called Jerusalem forever." Well, Pharaoh made a big mistake when he placed his name in Jerusalem forever because there was somebody else who placed his name in Jerusalem forever, and that was Yahuwah, the God of Israel. Okay, so he is the one who placed his name in Jerusalem forever, not Pharaoh. And we see that Gezer, Ashkelon, and Lachish have now started giving supplies to the Hebrews. So that means they have been subjected. Joshua is leading the armies of Israel, and he has conquested these areas, and they are now providing sustenance and trying to be peaceable so that they don't get taken over. Now, remember, the command was to lay them all waste, and Joshua does eventually do that. Um, Now, we also see this last tablet from this same mayor of Jerusalem. He says, the Habiru have taken all the cities. Not a single mayor remains. Turbazu and Yati-Hada were slain in the city-state of Silo, or Shiloh, as we would call it in Hebrew. The Habiru have killed Zimreda of Lachish. The king did nothing. Why? Now, that's a question that I'm going to answer for you today. Now, as Joshua is conquesting this land, and he is taking all of these cities and he's distributing them to the different tribes of Israel, the Pharaoh does not come and help any of these rulers of these cities. Now, bear in mind, it's been 40 years since the Exodus at this point. So, why is the Pharaoh still not coming to the aid of these people? Well, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, throughout this entire presentation series, I have not shown anything that was found by Ron Wyatt. And the main reason for that is not because I don't believe that Ron Wyatt's finds are legitimate. I very much do. But this presentation series is meant to be for more than just people like us. I have had the opportunity to present to some academics, and I've had recordings shown to different various people in universities and things. And so I try to avoid the topic of Ron Wyatt because He's uncredentialed and he's somebody that's not, part of their system. And I try to use their system against them. But it's impossible to talk about this particular topic without acknowledging one of Ron Wyatt's particular finds. And that is what you see here on the screen. Um, Ron Wyatt, as he was trying to identify the exact path that the Israelites took when they left out of Egypt and went over to the land of Midian, as the Bible calls it, which we understand Midian is what we would now call Saudi Arabia. Um, and in fact, Saudi Arabia was still called Midian up until I believe the 17 or 1800s. If you look at old maps, they will actually, in fact, the 1611 King James. If you've ever looked at an original 1611 King James, it has a bunch of maps in the front of it. And on the map of this land in the 1611 King James, it calls that land Midian, which is what we would now call Saudi Arabia. So Ron Wyatt smuggled himself and his two sons into Saudi Arabia for the purpose of trying to A, find exactly where the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, B, to find the real Mount Sinai. Because the Catholic Church has put forward a candidate for being Mount Sinai that is very clearly not actually Mount Sinai. It doesn't fit any of the descriptions in the text as far as the path that the Israelites took. It's on the wrong side of the branch of the Red Sea that would have been crossed. The Catholic Church has commoditized and has made a spectacle of the concept of a Mount Sinai, and they put a big cathedral up on top of this mountain that's not really Mount Sinai. And they've been charging people, lots of money to come and see all of the things that they put there as if it was Mount Sinai. It's not, it's a fraud. And I think just about everybody that's not Catholic knows that. Um, so Ron Wyatt was, in the 70s and 80s and even the 90s, he was really doing the most work of anybody on the face of the earth to identify the true locations of these places. So he smuggled himself into Saudi Arabia for the purposes of identifying where the Israelites crossed the Red Sea. And he had found a very, very believable place in the Sinai Peninsula on the western side of the Gulf of Aqaba called Nuweiba. And Nuweiba was where he thinks that the Israelites were pushed up against the sea because, you read in the Torah that the Israelites had been pushed up against the sea by the encroaching Egyptian army. The Egyptians regretted letting the Israelites leave, and they pushed them up against the Red Sea, where they had the Red Sea on one side and the Egyptian army on the other side. But what happens, we know from the biblical account, is that the column of fire that was leading them previously, it goes behind the camp and it stations itself in between the Egyptians and the Israelites, and it protects them. And there's a whole message just in that. But they had their backs up against the sea. And so Moses cries out to Yahuwah and says, what are we to do for these people? And basically Yahuwah tells him, why are you talking to me? Stretch out your hand and the sea will open and go through on dry ground. And that's exactly what happened. And so the Israelites go through, and it says that the waters were a wall to them on their left side and on their right. And they go through, the Egyptian army comes in to try to pursue them. And once all the Israelites are through this corridor, the waters close back in and drown the army of Pharaoh. Now, one popular misconception that I want to go ahead and dispel for you is the idea that Pharaoh himself died in that event. The Bible does not tell you that Pharaoh died in this event, but it's commonly believed that he did. And so part of that is just, as we tell this story and, details kind of get changed. And there's one verse in Psalms that people kind of turn to and like, look, well, it says that Pharaoh was crushed here, but that's figurative language. What it means is his army was destroyed. The way that pharaohs would lead the procession of their armies, they were always at the very back, and in fact, that's usually the case in pretty much all of ancient warfare. Is that you would have this retinue of the king and his nobles and his priests would be at the back of the procession of the army, and he would send out the troops ahead of him. And so it is my belief that Pharaoh was not consumed by the waters when they closed, but his whole army was. So we can expect from that event that there would be remnants of his army at the bottom of the ocean. Now, you have to remember that diving capabilities have really only existed, ever since the late 1900s. And prior to that, there was no way that anybody could have gotten down there. So as Ron Wyatt smuggles himself into Saudi Arabia with his two sons, he brings along with him diving equipment. And so for the very first time since the 1400s BC, a human being was going down in that particular area trying to see if there was, in fact, remnants of Pharaoh's army at the bottom of the Red Sea. Now, the I don't want to get too bogged down in this, but there's a very interesting topographical situation that happens at the place where he believed that they crossed, because the depth of the Red Sea is very, very deep in most places in that Gulf of Aqaba, but there's one place where there's essentially a land bridge where the waters are only about 300 feet deep across one strip. And it appears that that is actually the place that Yahuwah chose for the Israelites to cross over, in that place where it's shallow, now shallow relatively speaking. So because it's only, 300 feet deep in the deepest parts right there, Ron was able to dive down on the Saudi Arabia side and the Sinai Peninsula side and get in there. And what he found at the bottom was a bunch of remnants of chariots. And now bear in mind that was thousands of years prior to Ron Wyatt going down there. So the wood and the things like that has, of course, dissolved. But he found one particular chariot wheel that was gold plated. And this is the picture that he took of that gold plated chariot wheel that he found down there. Now, he did not move that one, because what essentially happens when you have something that's gold plated that's been in the water for this long is the wood under the gold has rotted and it has disappeared. And all you are left with is the very thin veneer of gold on top of it. So if you try to move that, there's a very good chance that you're going to break it. And Ron did not want to break it. So he left it as it was, but he took this picture, and we'll move on here. During the 1970s and 80s, biblical archaeologist Ron Wyatt discovered the remains of chariots and chariot wheels at the bottom of the Red Sea, precisely at the location where he believed the Israelites crossed through the sea on dry ground. In the biblical story, the sea then closed on the army of Egypt, where they died. He found various 4, 6, and 8-spoked chariot wheels at the bottom of the sea and turned many of them over to the Egyptian Antiquities Authority, where they were verified and dated to the 18th dynasty of Egypt by Nasif Mohammed Hassan, then the director of antiquities in Cairo. Now, there was a bunch of other chariot wheels besides this one that Ron did pull up. Okay, this is a part of the story that even if you've studied this before, you probably don't know this part. There's only one interview that's not one of the popular interviews where Mary Nell White, his wife, describes this event. And you really have to dig to find that video. But they did pull up several chariot wheels that were preserved by coral, and they took them to be verified at the Egyptian Antiquities Authority by this guy named Nasif Mohammed Hassan, who was very happy to find them, received them with joy, dated them to the 18th dynasty of Egypt, and then disappeared them. Okay, so this guy essentially tells Ron Wyatt that he's going to credit him for the find and that they're going to go into museums and be on display and yada yada. So Ron trusted him and left them in his care, and then nobody has seen these chariot wheels ever since. So what a surprise. And the main reason for that is that all of these countries that surround Israel are Islamic countries, and they do not want to do anything that will verify the veracity of the biblical text. And so the other chariot wheels got memory hold, but the picture that Ron took remains. Now, Professor Yigael Yadin maintains that during the earlier part of the 18th dynasty, the Egyptian chariot was exactly like the Canaanite chariot. Both were constructed of light, flexible wood with leather straps wrapped around the wood to strengthen it, and both utilized wheels with four spokes. In Yadin's eyes, the four-spoked wheel is diagnostic for dating purposes, and it is restricted to the early part of the 18th dynasty. So there's only one period of time where they are using four-spoke chariot wheels. And so this is where you want to look for the identity of the Exodus pharaoh is in this early to mid part of the 18th dynasty because of the fact that we have a picture of a gold-plated chariot wheel. And what it means to be gold-plated is that this would not have been a chariot that was likely used for warfare. This is more so a chariot of a noble or of a commander of the army or something like that. Now it's also interesting. Now Ron found all kinds of chariot remnants that I'm not going to talk about here today, but there's several almost intact chariot axles and things like that where the wheels are still attached. So there's all these shapes where you have like a round base, a thin shaft, and then another round base like that, and that's essentially an axle, with the wheels intact. But the majority of the chariot wheels that he found down there were just wheels with nothing attached. And see, even that corroborates the biblical account because if you remember, it tells you specifically that as the chariots were going through this corridor with the walls of water on both sides, it actually says that God caused the chariot wheels to fall off the chariots. And so in many of these cases, he's finding chariot wheels that are not connected to anything. And even that proves the veracity of the Bible, which says that the chariot wheels fell off, which I think is very interesting. So we know that we need to look in the 18th dynasty to learn about who would have been the pharaoh of the Exodus. Now, I'm going to introduce you to the 18th dynasty pharaohs. Okay. Now we're going to talk about all of the 18th dynasty pharaohs, and I'm gonna lay a groundwork for you and introduce you to these characters, and then I'm going to show you an interactive timeline and show you how the timeline of these pharaohs matches up with the timeline that the Bible gives us. But before I do that, here's some key scriptures that we need to remember before we even look at this issue. Okay, we know for a fact that a pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph and issued a decree to kill the Hebrew male babies because he was afraid the Hebrews would cause trouble if allowed to grow. That's Exodus 1:8. We know that Moshe, is put into the Nile River and is pulled out by Pharaoh's daughter. That happens in Exodus 2 and 5. Now, that term, Pharaoh's daughter, is a very particular title in the Egyptian language. So this is not just saying that she was a daughter of Pharaoh, she's Pharaoh's daughter. And now if you don't know about that title in the Egyptian way of doing things, you might just read that and not think that it's significant. But the title Pharaoh's daughter is a very specific term, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, Pharaoh's daughter names him Moshe, saying, because I pulled him out of the water. Now, this is important because when you study the name Moshe in Hebrew, you find that this is not a Hebrew word. Now, Hebrew is a language that is built on, the three-letter root words, and all of the language in one way or another ties back to these three-letter roots. Well, Moshe is not one of it doesn't tie back to an original Hebrew root. This is a borrowed word. This is a word that comes from the ancient Egyptian language. And many of the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty in particular have Moshe in their name. And the reason for that is this word means to be drawn out from or to come from something. And so when we look at the pharaohs whose names are Tutmoshe, well, that means I have been pulled out of Thoth. And Thoth was the Egyptian god of wisdom and knowledge. And so that name Tutmoshe means I have come forth out of Thoth, or I am imbued with wisdom and knowledge from Thoth. All right, so Pharaoh's daughter says, I will call him Moshe because I have pulled him out of the water. Moshe is taught all of the wisdom of the Egyptians. That comes from Acts chapter 7, verse 22. Now, if you're not familiar with Egyptian history, this doesn't mean much to you, but if you are familiar with Egyptian history, you know that they only taught all of their wisdom to pharaohs, prospective pharaohs, and the high priests. These are the only people who knew all of the wisdom of the Egyptians. It was not taught even to the noble class. It is, if you're going to be a pharaoh or if you're going to be a high priest, this is the only way you learn all of the wisdom of the Egyptians. So we can identify that the reason why Moses is pulled out of the water, that it has something to do with him being prepared to be a pharaoh, not just with him being somebody who's in Pharaoh's house. Moses refuses to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter and rejects the riches of Egypt. That comes from Hebrews chapter 11, verse 24. Now, these two scriptures right here are actually the most important scriptures for trying to identify the Exodus Pharaoh, which I think it's funny that they both come from the New Testament, because these are key scriptures for identifying the Exodus Pharaoh, and they are preserved for us by the New Testament and not actually from the Torah. Um, but it's a key point here that he refuses to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. We'll talk about what that means in a moment. Now, we have to also remember that Moses flees to Midian at 40 years old. That comes from Acts chapter 7, verse 23. So he's 40 when he goes into the land of Midian and he's running away from, the Egyptian authorities. That's a key verse because it helps you set up the timeline for who would be Pharaoh when this is all happening, because we know that he's 40 years old at this point. Now, after the course of many days, the Pharaoh of Egypt dies while Moses is in Midian. That comes from Exodus 2:23. So when Moses goes back to Egypt for the Exodus, he is standing before a different Pharaoh than the one that ran him out of the land. And that's an important thing to note. And a lot of Bible teachers, when they talk about these things, they don't account for that verse. And so when you're trying to identify who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, you have to acknowledge that Moses spends 40 years in Midian and then comes back, and there's a different Pharaoh when he comes back. So it's not the same one that was there when he left. Now, Moses returns at 80 years old. We get that from Exodus chapter 7, verse 7. And then we also know that Yahuwah tells Moses to tell Pharaoh to let Israel go, or else his firstborn son will die. That comes from Exodus 4:23. So when we're trying to find the Exodus Pharaoh, we have to have a Pharaoh whose firstborn son died inexplicably. Okay, so that's another key point here. Now, let's take a look at these 18th dynasty pharaohs. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. I don't want to get bogged down in it. A lot of this stuff, like I said, is meant for the academics, but I just want to introduce you to these characters real quick. So this is the very first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. His name is Moshe. Now, and when you see these names, it's Mose, but that's a sh, not a s. Moshe the first. And you're going to find that name Moshe all over the names of these pharaohs, which is interesting. Moshe the first is the first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty of kings. He ruled for 25 years and was the final liberator of Egypt from the Hyksos invaders after around 100 years of Hyksos oppression. Now, I'm not going to talk about the Hyksos today. When I present this teaching, I usually spend a lot of time talking about the Hyksos. I've decided to shorten this down a little bit, and that's going to be its own video, talking about the Hyksos, who they really were, why they were in Egypt, why they were rulers over Egypt. This is something that I'm not going to talk too much about today, but suffice it to say that Moshe deposes the Hyksos. He gets them out of the land of Lower Egypt, the Nile Delta, the Avaris, Goshen area, and he kicks them out and he unifies Egypt, and he becomes the first Egyptian ruler over a unified Egypt after the Hyksos have been expelled. This overthrow of the Hyksos is seen to be the beginning of the New Kingdom period, as well as the start of a new dynasty in which Egypt is said to have reached the peak of its power and influence. That's important. During this time of the 18th dynasty, Egypt becomes the most powerful that it ever was or will be. It's during this time. And why that's important is because the God of Israel says to Pharaoh, I have raised you up so that I may lay you low in the sight of the nations. So if you're looking for an Exodus Pharaoh, you want it to be the most powerful Pharaoh, because that gives the God of Israel the most amount of glory from laying him low. So Ahmose's son Amenhotep the first is the one who reigns after him. He reigns for 21 years, and he had the nickname "He who inspires great terror." He came to power after the death of his father Ahmose the first, and he was who was the founder of the 18th dynasty. Two of Egypt's most iconic literary works, the Ebers Papyrus and the Book of the Dead, date to his reign. He was the first pharaoh whose entire rule was after the complete destruction and eradication of the Hyksos. Given that the Hyksos were a Semitic people group, and Amenhotep I's early life would have been spent in the midst of a brutal war for liberation from the Hyksos, it stands to reason he would have strong anti-Semitic bias, and he would have taken measures to ensure that a Semitic people would never usurp the throne of Egypt again. So this guy has seen his grandfather and his father be at war, a bloody, brutal war with these Hyksos people. And so he knows for a fact that if you let Asiatic, Semitic peoples from, the Levant come down into your country, that they will take over and become rulers because he has watched his grandfather and his father liberate the nation of Egypt from these people. So he's going to be very paranoid. He's going to be somebody who takes measures to prevent outside peoples from being able to gain power enough to depose the pharaohs again. That's going to be important in a minute. Now, his son, Tutmosis I, is the next pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. Tutmosis I reigns for about 13 years. During his reign, Egypt expanded its territories. He's the first pharaoh to build a tomb at the famed Valley of the Kings. And so this incredible archaeological place called the Valley of the Kings, he constructs that area. He's the first one to be buried there. Very, very interesting. We're not going to look too much at that today, but it's an awesome place. If you're ever just looking for something from Egypt that you want to study, the Valley of the Kings is a really cool place. Now, he also built the Temple of Karnak, which would see continuous additions added by his descendants for many generations. The Temple of Karnak is also a very interesting place. Not going to talk about it much today. Of his several legitimate children, the only surviving child by he and his great royal wife, Ahmose, is at the time of his death was his beloved daughter Hatshepsut, who bore the title daughter of Pharaoh. Now, this is important, and this is where we're getting to the crux of the biblical narrative. Tutmosis I does not have legitimate sons by his great royal wife to be able to rule after him. And that's an important note. He has daughters only, and the chief of which is this woman named Hatshepsut, who bears the title daughter of Pharaoh, Pharaoh's daughter. Now, how the pharaohs would rule is they would have a great royal wife. She's the big bad wife. She's the one that is the one who would produce the one who would rule after him. But then they would also have a bunch of concubines, and so it would be kind of similarly to how it was done in Israel. But if at all possible, they try to avoid having sons of concubines become the pharaohs. They want it to really be from a son from the great royal wife. But in this instance, with Tutmosis I, he doesn't have any sons born by his great royal wife to be able to rule after him. And so Hatshepsut is primed to potentially become the next ruler. But this is a very tenuous thing to try to do to install a woman as the pharaoh. It had only been done a handful of times prior to this time, and it wasn't done with very much efficacy. The merchant class, in particular, did not like being ruled over by women, and so they would only do this in extreme circumstances. But he did have a son named Tutmosis II by a lesser wife, who ends up taking the throne after his death. So Tutmosis I was kind of thinking he wants his daughter to be the pharaoh, but at first she's kind of rejected because of the fact that he had a son through one of his concubines. And so what he ends up doing instead is making his son through a concubine the pharaoh after him. And that's Tutmosis II. Now, Tutmosis II was the son of Tutmosis I by way of a lesser wife. Since this made his claim weaker than usual, he marries Tutmosis I's royal daughter, Hatshepsut. So Tutmosis II knows that he's essentially what we would have called a bastard in Middle English. And so he knows he needs to kind of shore up his claim a little bit. So he marries his own half sister, Hatshepsut, to try to give himself, some solidity on his throne. Now, he only reigns for a short time before dying prematurely of an apparent skin condition. His mummy still bears nasty lesions around his neck, chest, and throat area, so he dies very young. and he's only had a few children with Hatshepsut when he dies. He and Hatshepsut only had daughters during their brief time together. So, like his father, Tutmosis II did have a son by a lesser wife, but due to his untimely death as a young man, his only son was too young to rule after him at the time of his death, which left a vacuum on the throne. So, we've had two pharaohs in a row now, both who have the name Moshe in their name, and they don't have sons to be able to come up after them by their great royal wives. And I believe that this was from Yahuwah, that he caused this to happen for a reason, because he only had daughters with Hatshepsut. So now we will look at Hatshepsut because she becomes pharaoh after her husband slash half brother dies. Hatshepsut was the eldest surviving child of Tutmosis I at the time of the death of her husband, Tutmosis II. And because she still carried the title Pharaoh's daughter, which had far more pull than great royal wife, she was the rightful heir to the throne until Tutmosis II's illegitimate son, Tutmosis III, was of age. Although not the first or only female pharaoh, she does seem to have been the most successful and most prolific female builder. She built the very elaborate Djeser temple, which was part of a very large complex that was at a center for worship and learning. When Tutmosis III came of age, rather than cede full rulership to the young pharaoh, she decided to give him control of the army but retain the court for herself, which she ruled until her death. Now, this is a picture right here of the Djeser complex that she built. It's still there. It's very, very much intact, actually. It's just a sprawling, incredible place. It was basically a university and a temple in the same place, which I think is funny because the ancient world used to acknowledge that those two things were worked together. Now they try to act like institutions of higher learning are not religious complexes, but they very much are. They're just pushing the religion of humanism rather than the religion of serving the God of Israel. But anyway, she becomes pharaoh. She starts wearing the ceremonial beard. She takes over for a good little while after her husband slash half brother dies, and his only son, who would be called Tutmosis III, is not old enough to come to the throne yet. So she gets a period of time there where she rules as the pharaoh. And then when Tutmosis III is old enough to be able to start ruling, they share a co-regency where she lets him be in charge of the army, but she keeps the court for herself. So you have two pharaohs ruling at the same time after, towards the later part of her reign. And this is Tutmosis III, the last one that we're going to look at here. He's often regarded as the most powerful pharaoh in all of Egypt's ancient history. He coalesced the rule of all Northeast Africa and even the tribute of Canaan to the throne. He was a brilliant military strategist and had no less than 17 successful military campaigns during his life, by far the most of any pharaoh. His military exploits have often led to him being called the Napoleon of Egypt. And under his rule, Egypt enjoyed prosperity and position never again fully achieved after his death. So when you talk about powerful pharaohs, the most noteworthy, the ones who did the most for the kingdom, Tutmosis III is the biggest, baddest pharaoh that ever lived. He was the biggest. He is also quite well known for committing what may be the most heinous act of religious violence in the history of Egypt. 25 years after her death, Tutmosis III vandalized and or destroyed many monuments which stood to honor his stepmother Hatshepsut. This unprecedented action has puzzled Egyptologists for centuries, since it is well known that he was fond of his stepmother. He even kept her religious and administrative court when she died and had his mortuary complex built directly beside hers. Had there been animosity between them, these would not have happened. So, this is the crux. This is the one thing that will help you identify who is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Because remember, in part one of this teaching, when we looked at the Rosetta Stone, I told you that the Egyptian pharaohs believed that the only way that they could have a good afterlife is if they had monuments built to their memory in the world of the living. So the quality of their afterlife was totally dependent on them having monuments that bore their name and bore their victories and things in the histories. That was the only way you could have a good afterlife. And so up until this point, and Egypt has existed for over 1,000 years at this point, not one single pharaoh has ever desecrated the monuments of another pharaoh. This is something that has never happened before. It never happened again after it. And you know why? Is because pharaohs were scared to desecrate the monuments of previous pharaohs because they didn't want to set the precedent that that was okay to do because then somebody might come later and desecrate their monument and then they would be poor in the afterlife and not be remembered and not have status in the afterlife. So the fact that Tutmose III defaced and destroyed monuments of Hatshepsut is the most incredible, ridiculous thing that any pharaoh ever did, according to the academics. They cannot make sense of this. It doesn't matter who you ask in academic circles, they have no idea why that happened. Well, I'm going to tell you why it happened in just a minute. But bear in mind, Tutmose III was so fond of Hatshepsut. He liked her so much. She was his stepmother. You know, she allowed him to come to power when he came of age. There was no rivalry between them. They worked very well together. He built his tomb to be next to hers. And they're very, very superstitious about who they allow themselves to be buried next to because then they're going to be placed next to them in the afterlife. So Tutmose did not always hate Hatshepsut. He came to hate her 25 years after her death, inexplicably, or at least it would be if you didn't know the biblical story. So now I'm going to build a timeline for you. And we're going to look at how all this fits in. Well, we'll go ahead and talk about Amenhotep II. So his son Amenhotep II comes after him. He's the next pharaoh to sit on the throne, though not the eldest son of Tutmose III. Amenhotep's older brother, the crown prince Amenemhat, died inexplicably before taking the throne. So Amenhotep II, Tutmose III's son, he's not the firstborn son. He was not supposed to be the one who ruled after Tutmose. He was a secondborn son, and he came to the throne because his older brother died. Amenhotep II was a valiant man, but he only waged two successful war campaigns, far fewer than his father, and he returned from one campaign with over 100,000 slaves. The purpose of the campaign was to replenish his slave force. Now, why would a pharaoh be going out on a campaign specifically to bring back as many slaves as he could? It's because he's trying to replenish his slave force. Why would he need to replenish his slave force? Because all his slaves were gone. You see where I'm going with this. Now, this is a wall carving of Amenhotep II, and this shows him around the time that he comes to power. And notice the chariot that he is riding on has four spokes on it. Okay, so now we are coming full circle. So we know for a fact that Amenhotep II rode in a chariot that had four spokes. So this is the exact time period, which only lasted for a couple generations, where the pharaohs and their armies are riding around on chariots that have four spokes. So now let's look at a timeline, how this all fits together. Why did I spend all that time introducing you to all these pharaohs? Here we go. So the first thing that happens on this timeline is the Semitic Hyksos invade and rule the Nile Delta. The Nile Delta is the land of Goshen. Okay, so the Hyksos are ruling over the area that we would call Goshen or that the academics call Avaris. And this is happening in the 17th century BCE. Right after that, we have Akhmoshe I, who is the one who wages these military campaigns against the Hyksos, overthrows them, and takes back control of Egypt from them. He expels them in the 16th century BCE, and that begins the New Kingdom age in the 18th dynasty. Now he reigns for 25 years. And after that, his son, who we met, Amenhotep I, takes control. Now he is nervous of Semites because of the Hyksos. And Amenhotep I believe, orders the death of the Hebrew males. So I believe that this is the pharaoh who gave forth that decree. He was known as the one who inspires great terror. He, more than any other pharaoh, was very, very nervous about allowing populations of Semitic peoples within Egypt to grow because he did not want a repeat of the whole Hyksos disaster. So I believe that he is the one who ordered the killing of the Hebrew males. And he does that at the very end of his reign, which lasts for 21 years. Now, continuing on the timeline, his son, Tutmose I, becomes the pharaoh. But he, by his great royal wife, Akhmose, only has daughters. And so here's Hatshepsut, the daughter of Pharaoh, as it were. Now, she has watched her father go through this same process of becoming the Pharaoh when there was no legitimate son to be able to follow after him. So Hatshepsut's keenly aware that if she becomes Pharaoh, that she needs to have a son, and she only has girls by her husband. And so she, more than anybody in all of Egyptian history, needs a son to be able to solidify her own throne because the people of Egypt do not want to have a woman ruling over them already. And if she comes to the throne and doesn't have a son that is going to be Pharaoh after her, she knows that she's going to have a really hard time convincing the Egyptians to accept her as the ruling Pharaoh. So she needs a son, right? So she goes to the water, finds a Hebrew baby in a basket, and poof, the light goes off in her head. This is the answer. This is my son. This is the one that I will prime to be the ruler after me, and this will solidify my claim to the throne. So enter Moshe. And so at the top of this timeline is going to follow Moshe and the events of his life, and then the bottom of the timeline is going to follow the Egyptians. You'll see how that plays out. So we have young Moshe pictured here. He is growing up in the court of Pharaoh. He is being primed to be the Pharaoh. And we know that because of Acts 7:22 and Hebrews 11:24 that we just talked about. Acts 7:22 says he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. The only way that he would have received all the wisdom of the Egyptians is if he was being primed to be the Pharaoh. And then we also see that it says that he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now, when does he do that? He doesn't do that early on in his life. He does that at the moment when he flees and spends 40 years in Midian. So he kills a taskmaster. And this is unacceptable. Okay, because remember, they've just had this issue of the Hyksos a few generations before. This is a very tenuous situation where you have millions and millions and millions of Hebrews in your land, and it's a very tense political climate at this time. This is a time when you cannot allow rebellion to foment because these slaves are, if they get the idea that they want to overthrow the pharaohs, there's a lot more of them than there are of the Egyptians. The scripture actually tells you that because they were worried about the numbers of the Hebrews because the Hebrews were having, 12, 14, 15 kids each. And so they went from being a people that numbered 70 to being a people that numbered 3 or 4 million in just a few generations. And so the pharaohs are very worried about a tense political situation developing where the Hebrews might actually try to overthrow the pharaohs. So when Moses, the crown prince of Egypt, kills a slave master on behalf of the Hebrews to protect their dignity and their honor, Hatshepsut cannot have this. Hatshepsut cannot endure this level of political violence because she understands that this could cause all of the slaves to revolt. So Moshe, even though he is the crown prince of Egypt, he has to be exiled. And they were trying to kill him. They didn't want to exile him. They wanted to kill him because in their mind, that's the only way to put down this potential rebellion that's going to happen now because you can't allow something like this to happen. So when he did what he did to kill that slave master, he was refusing to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He basically gave up his station. He stepped away from his position as the future Pharaoh when he made that act because he could never be Pharaoh after that. He could never be somebody who acted as a liberator for the Hebrew people and then come to be the chief slave master of them. That was never going to happen. So when he made that choice, he knew exactly what he was doing. And as the New Testament tells us, what he was doing is he was refusing to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing to endure affliction with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. That's what the scripture says. So he was making the choice to stand with God's people in solidarity rather than enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. And we know that in all of these ways, Moses is very much a type of the coming Christ. He is a picture of the Messiah, um, because he had lofty position. He was going to be the king of the world, as it were. He had everything he needed to have a great life, but he stepped away from all of that to endure affliction on account of the people of God. And that's exactly what Yeshua did. He didn't have any need to come down here. He was, primed to be the king of all the universe, right? He's the son of the living God. He had no need to come and endure suffering on account of the people of God unless it was to save them, right? So Moses is serving as a picture of the Messiah when he does this by stepping down from his lofty position to come and be the deliverer of God's people, which I think is very powerful. Now we know what happens next after the 40 years that Moses spends in Midian. Moses comes back and it's time for the Exodus. All right. So that's Moses's timeline. Now let's look at what was happening with the Egyptians during this time. So Tutmose the first, we talked about that by his lesser wife Mutnofret, he does not have, or he doesn't have any sons by Akhmose, but he does have one by Mutnefret, and that's Tutmose the second. Tutmose the second became pharaoh, and he married Hatshepsut to solidify his throne, but they have only daughters together. But he does have a son by his lesser wife, Isit, and that is Tutmose the third, right? So around the time that Hatshepsut lives and reigns for 21 years after she becomes pharaoh. So for 21 years, she is the pharaoh of Egypt. Now, Hatshepsut tries to kill Moses. And this was an incredible thing for me to come to the realization about because Moshe does not talk about this. And you have to remember that when Moshe is writing the Torah, he's not writing it as a journal. Okay. He's being inspired by the Spirit of the living God to tell the story that Yahuwah wants you to know, not the version of events that came from Moshe's perspective. Because if Moshe was writing it from his own perspective, you can bet he would have mentioned that. Like, my mom tried to kill me. Can you believe it? But we know that this is what happened when you put this timeline together. She feels the ultimate betrayal by what he did because she pulled him out of the river. He was nobody. He was supposed to be dead. If she would have kept the laws of her land, she would have taken his little ark and just flipped it upside down and just killed him because that was what was supposed to have happened to him. But instead, she took him, made him her son, trained him in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, raised him in the royal court, primed him to be the pharaoh. She had taken a nobody and had turned him into the most powerful person in the world. And so in her mind, she has done everything for this man. And then when he killed that slave master and refused to be called her daughter or refused to be called her son, this is the ultimate betrayal. And she sees it as an absolute affront to everything that she did for him to give him his position. And so she is the one who tries to kill him and she chases him away. Now, she did not want Moshe the third to rule. She wanted Moshe to rule. But after this event happens where she is forced to run Moshe out of the land of Egypt, she now has no choice but to set up Tutmose III, her stepson, to be the pharaoh after. So Tutmose III comes to power at this time that Moshe has run out, and he reigns for 54 years. And this is when the co-regency begins with Hatshepsut and Tutmose III both ruling at the same time. Now, Tutmose III rules for a long time, 54 years. It's one of the longest pharaohs to ever rule. He rules for a very long time. But his rule culminates right around the time of the Exodus. Now, Hatshepsut dies while Moses is in Midian, right? So one of the things that is communicated when Moshe is having the burning bush experience is he is told all of those who seek your life have passed away. So we know that Moses got word while he was in Midian that everybody who was trying to kill him prior to that has now passed away. So his adoptive mother dies while he's in Midian. And he knows then that if he goes back, he does not have to face her, essentially. So we have this event of the Exodus, which is happening towards the end of Tutmose III's reign. This happens in roughly 1446 BC. Tutmose III, then, after the Exodus, defaces Hatshepsut's monuments 25 years after her death. So this is why Tutmose III destroys Hatshepsut's monuments, is because he, being the most powerful pharaoh, he's led the most military campaigns. He is the most well regarded. He has set himself up for the best afterlife that any pharaoh is ever going to have. And then all of a sudden, in one turn of events, in one season of a year, he loses his entire army. He is laid lower than any pharaoh has ever been laid low, and he is made a fool of to the entire world. Remember what, when the Israelites are going and they're coming into Jericho, and the spies go into the house of Rahab the harlot, what does she say to them? She says, "We have heard the fame of you guys. We are scared of you because we have heard what your God did to the gods of the Egyptians," right? So the fame of this event went out all over the entire earth. And Tutmose III, who was used to being the biggest, baddest person on the face of the world, is now the lowest. And he has been laid low. He has been made a fool of like nobody in history has ever been made a fool of. And so what does he do? He goes and destroys the monuments of Hatshepsut, because who pulled Moshe out of the river? Who raised him and primed him to be who he was going to be? Moses exists because of Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut is the one who placed him in a position where he could be the one to do what ended up happening to him later. And so Tutmose III blames Hatshepsut for Moses. And there you go. There's your reason for why he did what he did. The academics can't see it because they absolutely refuse to look to the Bible for anything. But if you place these timelines on top of the timeline of the Bible, you realize exactly why that happened, right? So Tutmose III has his firstborn son die inexplicably. Now, Amenemhat was supposed to be the pharaoh after Tutmose III, and his son Amenemhat had actually already been given the position of in the government called I believe it was called the keeper of the cattle or something, like the minister of the affairs of the cattle. So he held a position in the high court of the pharaoh, and he was being given more and more responsibilities. He was being primed to become the pharaoh after Tutmose III, and then he dies, and there's nothing in any of the histories. There is nothing in any of the carvings, like anytime that you had somebody who was the crown prince who was supposed to become the pharaoh later, anytime they died, like they would write records, they would have a burial complex, there would be the story of what happened to them. None of that exists for Amenemhat. Now, what does it tell you? It tells you that they were burying their dead in the streets. We talked about that last time. That Ipuwer Papyrus says that the Egyptians are burying their dead in the streets. Well, that's something they would never do. They were very superstitious about how they buried people. So Amenemhat, the crown prince of the most powerful pharaoh of all time, does not have a burial complex. He does not have anything that belongs to him that they would normally give somebody of his station, and there's no explanation for how or why he died. So this fits perfectly with the text of the Bible that tells you that the Exodus, that it literally says that during this time of the Exodus, that I will send the spirit of death into Egypt, and he will kill the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne, all the way down to the firstborn of the people in the prisons. So literally everybody everywhere is going to have their firstborn son die, and that's exactly what happened to Tutmose III. His firstborn son, who was supposed to be the pharaoh after him, dies inexplicably. There's no explanation for what happened. Nobody knows where he's buried. He completely disappears from the Egyptian histories, and there's no explanation for why. So his younger brother, Amenhotep II, then becomes the next pharaoh. Very interesting, isn't it? Now, let's keep the timeline going. On the top's going to be Israel's timeline, on the bottom's Egypt's. Israel then wanders in the desert for 40 years, following the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. That is happening while Amenhotep II is the pharaoh. Now, remember what I told you about Amenhotep II? He goes on a military campaign to replenish the slave force. Why does he need to replenish the slave force? Because all the slaves just left. And all of their building projects and everything that they were doing at the time, it's left undone. And this is a very, very embarrassing problem for the pharaohs. So they then have to replenish their slave force. Now, Amenhotep II reigns for 26 years, and then he dies. And Moses dies in around 1406 BCE. So Moses dies right at the end of Israel wandering in the desert for 40 years. And then we have Joshua. So Joshua comes at right after Moses, and as soon as Moses dies, it's time, guys. Let's go. We got to go take this land. We're going to give it to the people of Israel. We're going to fulfill all the prophecies. Like it's time to take this land. And so he does. And the main part of his conquest lasts anywhere between 8 to 12 years. The length of the main conquest is a little bit iffy, but most of the conquesting was done during that 12 years. Now, would you believe me if I told you that according to the dating that is academically accepted by everybody in academia and all the Egyptologists, the Amarna letters begin to be written in 1399 BCE, which is 7 years after the death of Moses. So all those letters that we looked at that talk about all these people in Canaan writing to the Pharaoh asking for help, hey, come help us, everything. This is exactly the timeline when they start being written, is right here square in the middle of when Joshua's conquest would have been happening. So don't tell me there's no proof that the Exodus happened, okay? Because when you match the biblical timeline together with the academic timeline for the Amarna letters, the Amarna letters begin being written right in the middle of Joshua's conquest. This is not a coincidence, okay? Joshua existed. He really did sack these places, and you can prove that with archaeology. Now, after Amenhotep II dies, his son Tutmose IV comes to reign after him. And he explains why he's the pharaoh in a very interesting way. So there's something called the Sphinx stele. And the Sphinx stele, or it's also sometimes called the dream stele, it's this big stone carving that is right in between the feet of the Sphinx in Giza. So when you've got the three, main pyramids right there in the Giza Plateau, you've got the Sphinx right there beside them. Well, at the feet of that Sphinx, there's a stele right there with carvings, which was done by Tutmose IV. And on that stele, he is explaining why he came to be pharaoh instead of his other brother. And Tutmose IV's older brother also died inexplicably, and Tutmose IV becomes pharaoh. So you say, how does that happen? Why do we have two different pharaohs who both have their firstborn sons die and then another one comes to the throne? Well, remember, Tutmose III, he reigned for 54 years. Okay, so he was an old man at the time of the Exodus. So both his son and his grandson are affected by the death of the firstborn. So Tutmose IV was alive during the time of the Exodus, and his older brother, who was not necessarily the crown prince because their father had to first be the pharaoh, but you had three generations of pharaohs alive at one time during the time of the Exodus because of how long Tutmose the third reigned. So you have Amenhotep coming to power because Amenemhat died inexplicably, and then you have Tutmose IV coming to power because his older brother died inexplicably, and both of them were killed by the plague of the death of the firstborn. So Tutmose IV has to kind of give some kind of explanation for why he, being a second-born son, is ending up being the pharaoh. So he creates this elaborate story where the Sphinx came to him in a dream and said, if you will wipe the sands from off my feet and clean up my structure, then I will make you the pharaoh. So that was how he chose to sell that to the people, was that it was this incredible miracle done by the Sphinx, and that's why I became pharaoh instead of my older brother. But we know the truth because we read the scriptures. The scripture tells us Tutmose IV's older brother, who would have been pharaoh instead of him, was killed during the plague of the firstborn, and that's why Tutmose IV ended up having to reign. Now, I put this particular picture of Tutmose IV's mummy here on purpose because when they studied Tutmose IV's mummy, they found that he had these incredible boils all over his skin. So he was covered from head to toe in scarring from what had been a very bad plague of boils. Now, have you ever heard of a plague of boils? That was one of the plagues of Egypt. So he was a boy when this was happening, when the Exodus was taking place, and he was covered head to toe with boils. And his mummy, still to this very day, if you go and look at it in the museum where it is housed, you can see the scarring from the boils. Now that's powerful because it proves definitively that what the Bible is telling you is true. Because we have the physical remains of somebody who was a child during the Exodus, and their skin is covered in the scarring from a terrible outbreak of boils. This is not a coincidence. Now, he only reigns 10 years. He's very sickly and he dies early. Now, after he dies, we have the rest of the conquest of Joshua, right? So we know that Joshua goes on to conquer the entire land that was called Canaan. It is then called Israel because the children of Israel have taken it. They've divided it up. And so Israel conquests and then settles this land all the way up until 722 BCE when they are eventually destroyed. So they're in the land, for over 700 years. And this is very significant. You can also prove that a lot, which we did in part one of this series a few weeks ago. But Tutmose IV's son becomes pharaoh after him when he dies, and that's Amenhotep III. So Amenhotep III is the pharaoh that some of these Amarna letters were written to. So the very earliest Amarna letters were written to Tutmose IV, and then the rest of them were written to Amenhotep III. So these are the two pharaohs that were ruling during the time of Joshua's conquest. So why, remember what I read earlier from that Amarna letter when the mayor of Jerusalem's like, hey, why didn't you come help us? Why didn't you send help to me? Like these Habiru's are coming and taking our land. Why didn't you come help? Well, Tutmose IV was still covered in the boils. Moshe the Fourth still had the scars on his flesh from what the God of Israel had done to him when he was a boy. Of course, he's not going to come fight against the God of Israel. Of course, he wouldn't, because he still bears the marks in his flesh of the power of that God of Israel. So, of course, he didn't respond to the letters that were asking for help. And then his son doesn't respond either because he grew up hearing about the Exodus. He grew up knowing that his great grandfather, who was the greatest Pharaoh who ever lived, was laid low by the power of this God of Israel. Of course, they're not going to come help them. It takes a while for Egypt to get back into the practice of going to war with Israel. It takes a long time for them to forget this event of the Exodus. Now, Amenhotep III rules for 38 years. So he has a long reign. So the vast majority of those Amarna letters were written to Amenhotep III, because he rules for the entire time that Israel is conquesting the land of Canaan. Now, when he dies, his son Akhenaten becomes the pharaoh. Now, Akhenaten is a very interesting figure, and I could talk absolutely all day about Akhenaten. I'm not going to do that because we've been going on for a long time here. I'm about to wrap this up. But Akhenaten does something very, very interesting during his life. And that is that he institutes a monotheistic reform. Now, when you look all throughout the ancient cultures of the world, there's only a couple instances where the ruler of a pagan people that is polytheistic, meaning they worship many gods all at once, where they shed all of those polytheistic gods and then begin to worship one singular God. It's very rare for that to happen. It's only happened a handful of times throughout all of history. Now, in part two of this series, when we looked at, Nineveh, I showed you definitively that there is a king of Nineveh, Adad-nirari III, who instituted a monotheistic reform. And we took the stuff that was found about him and we compared it with the Bible, and we proved that he was the king of Nineveh that the prophet Jonah went to. So you can prove with archaeology that the story of Jonah is true. And so Adad-nirari III throws off the gods of his ancestors and begins worshiping one true God. Well, that same thing happens here with Akhenaten. So bear in mind who Akhenaten is. He's the great great grandson of Tutmose III, the great grandson of Amenhotep II, and the grandson of Tutmose IV. Those three men who endured the Exodus. Okay. And then Akhenaten's father, Amenhotep III, is the one to whom the vast majority of the Amarna letters were written. So Akhenaten was alive and was watching the conquest of Israel happen. He knew that Joshua was defeating these incredibly powerful nations of giants who he himself probably feared, and watched these Habiru, these Israelites, go and conquest this entire land. Akhenaten is doing some math here, and he's saying, you know what? Our gods were laid low when my great great grandfather was Pharaoh. I knew my grandfather, who still was poxmarked all over his body by the plague of the boils. I just watched Joshua just lay low this entire land of giants. You know what? I think our gods are rotten. And so Akhenaten institutes a religious reform, and he kicks off all of the gods of ancient Egypt, every single one of them. Osiris to Ra to you name it, all these gods that have been worshipped for thousands of years. He says, nah, this is fraudulent religion. This is fake. That God over there, that's the God of the Hebrews, he's the real God. He's the one that's doing the work. All right. So he gets rid of all the gods of Egypt. He moves the capital city away from the two places where it had been prior to that, and he creates an entirely new city. He says, you know what? I can't reuse these temples because they are desecrated by the worship of false gods. I can't use this capital city because there's been so much wickedness in the city. I have to build an entirely new city because it's the only way that I can get away from the filth of my forefathers. So Akhenaten builds a city called Akhetaten, and he creates a library in Akhetaten that houses the Amarna letters. So, as it would be if Yahuwah was pulling the strings on all these different things, the man who threw off the gods of ancient Egypt and built a brand new city is the one who preserved the Amarna letters. When they were discovered, that woman was just kicking around in the desert and she accidentally kicked one of them. That was the ruins of the city of Akhetaten that had been built by Akhenaten. And so this man is the only reason why we know that these letters exist. It's the only reason why they were preserved because his monotheistic reform, just like the one that was done by Adad-nirari III of Nineveh, it only lasted one generation. Because do you know who Akhenaten's son was? You might have heard of him. His name was Tutankhamun, King Tut. So Akhenaten is King Tut's father. And King Tut was not having any of this new religion. So that only lasted one generation. And Akhenaten's wife was Nefertiti. And so Nefertiti was not a fan of his reforms, neither was his son, uh, Tut and Common, King Tut. So as soon as Akhenaten dies, his religious reform dies with him. He was the only one who had that spiritual wherewithal to cast off the false gods of Egypt. His own son undoes everything that he started, and Egypt goes right back to Thebes. They go right back to Karnak. They go right back to their old ways. And so that city that Akhenaten built, Akhetaten, it falls into ruin in one generation, and it stays in ruin, covered by the sands of time, clear up until the modern era when we find the Amarna letters, which is one of the most powerful proofs that the Bible is actually real. And so I named this three-part series The Witness of the Sands with this particular situation in mind, because the sands covered up all of these things that prove that the Bible is real. But I think it's just profound that it was Akhenaten is the one who preserved these Amarna letters. And so now we're able to go back and look at this and prove that the Bible and the story of the Exodus is true because of this man and the things that he did. So I'm going to stop talking about him now. We're going to wrap up just by looking at a couple quick things, and then I'll be done here. The last thing I want to show you is Rekhmire's tomb. Now, this relief was discovered on the walls of the tomb of Rekhmire, the governor of Thebes and vizier to Tutmose III. And it depicts Semitic slaves making bricks for construction. So I've proven to you now that Tutmose III is the pharaoh of the Exodus. Well, his vizier, his right-hand man, is this guy named Rekhmire. And Rekhmire, in his own burial complex, has on the walls of his burial complex images of the Hebrew slaves making bricks. And we know from the Bible that this is exactly the task that the Hebrew slaves were tasked with, was the making of bricks. It talks about that in great detail. Now, as you look at this, notice the multicultural nature of the Hebrews depicted here, with 4 hair colors and 3 skin tones. This is a profound thing because we know for a fact that these are Hebrews because it's the vizier who was in control of Egypt during the time that the Israelites were slaves making bricks. And so we know who these people are. And when you look at them, you see black skin, you see brown skin, you see white skin, and you see tan skin. You see black hair, you see blonde hair, you see red hair. And so you say, how could the Israelites have been a multicultural people? They come from 4 wives of the man Jacob. So Jacob has the bulk of the children of Israel, 8 sons by the 2 twin daughters who are Leah and Rachel. Okay, so most of the Israelites are going to share a complexion, but there are also 2 other wives that come from different nationalities of people. And I believe that one of those wives was black and that one of them was more Asian. And that what you end up with in the 12 sons of the man Israel is Asian looking people, white looking people, and black looking people because of the wives of the man Jacob. And I believe that the bulk of them were probably what we would call Caucasian or white. They come from Rachel and Leah, who were the daughters of a man named Laban. Now, what does the word Laban mean in Hebrew? It means white. Okay, so he wasn't named white for no reason. I think that most of them would have been of a similar complexion, but I think you had 2 tribes each that were also African and of Asian appearance. And when Israel ended up falling in 722 BC, I believe that the ones that were black in appearance, that they migrated down into Africa. I believe the ones that were Asian in appearance, they migrated into Asia, and that the ones that were white in appearance, that they migrated into Europe. And so I think that this was all orchestrated by God to create a multicultural identity to the Israelites, even when they were in the land. And then when they dispersed amongst people that looked like them. Um, that's a whole other topic, and there's a lot else that I could say about this that I'm not going to, but it's very telling in this relief on the walls of somebody that we know was alive during the time that the Israelites were making bricks. We have black people, we have white people, we have Asian people, and we have redheads, all depicted among these slaves that were making the bricks. And I think that's just it's a beautiful picture. And I think what it does is it shuts up every single person who tries to make the Israelite race their own. Because you have the black Hebrew Israelites who believe that the Israelites could only have been black, and everybody who's not black can't ever possibly be part of Israel. And then you also have white groups that say the same thing. And both of these groups are ignoring the fact that the Israelites themselves were multicultural already because of the different wives that Jacob had. And so I think God set it up this way because he knew that they were going to be dispersed and that they were going to mix in amongst the other peoples. And so they were already looking like where they were going to end up going. And I think it's a profound thing, this one particular find. But anyway, there you go, right there in the Egyptian archaeological record. You have yourself the Israelites making bricks on the walls of the tomb of the guy who was telling them what to do, the vizier, the governor of Thebes, the one who was overseeing all of these building projects. And there they are, right there, the Hebrews making bricks. So this is my last slide right here. If you remember from the very first time that I presented, the very first section of this teaching series, we looked at Joshua's altar that was found in the land of Israel. And I told you all the way back then that one of the things that was pulled out of that altar was a scarab seal. Remember the royal scarab found at Mount Ebal? That's Moshe III. That's literally what that says right there in the hieroglyphs. That's on that thing that was found in the altar that Joshua built. It literally is the royal scarab of Tutmoshe III. The Israelite who was holding that and who cast it into that altar was telling you who the Pharaoh of the Exodus was. They I believe it was put there that it was preserved all of this time so that we could look at it and we could know and we could put the pieces together and we could give glory to the God who laid him low. Hallelujah. So that concludes my presentation series, The Witness of the Sands. If you enjoyed this and you haven't seen the other parts of this presentation, I have part one, part two, and part three on my YouTube. You can go back and watch them anytime. Gregory, thank you for having me. It's been a joy to share all of this with you. I hope that you have been blessed by all of these things. And anyway, be blessed.
Well, okay, you guys should know this one. And when we get down to the blessing, if you agree after the blessing, then just say on your end, so be it. Okay? And so we're going to sing the song of peace to close this service. And the song is Shalom, my friends. And it goes like this. Shalom to you now. Shalom, my friends. May Yahweh's mercies bless you well, my friends, in all your living and through your loving. Yahweh be your shalom, shalom, shalom. Yahweh be your shalom. And now, as we go throughout the week, know of a certainty that our Heavenly Father is looking after you and your family. We can't see it with physical eyes, but by faith we perceive it, don't we? And sometimes, maybe even sometimes, the Father might reveal himself in a special way to you. And so the blessing. May Yahweh answer you in the day of trouble. May the name of the Elohim of Jacob protect you. May he send you help from the sanctuary and sustain you from Zion. May he remember all your gifts and look favorably on your many prayer offerings. And we answer, so be it. May he give you the desires of your heart and make all your plans succeed. May we shout for joy at your victory and raise a banner in the name of our Elohim. May Yahweh grant you all your petitions. And we say, so be it. All right, my friends. Remember the encouragement that was given to Joshua, Hazak, Hazak, Vinit, Hazak, be strong, be strong. May we be strengthened in faith in the blessed Son, our Lord and Savior, Yeshua, Messiah. Hallelujah.